Okay.
Okay. Now this is going to be kind of a hodgepodge of things as I think of them and remember them. I said my parents were wonderful people. They really were. They were very supportive, and one of the greatest gifts they gave us was intellectual curiosity. And they were always learning and trying and doing things. Mama was one of the founders, volunteer founders of the library in town. Pop did all kinds of things. He came, though, from very little money, farming family in Kansas. And during the Depression, he had this garden shop in New York City, this flower shop in New York City, which went kerplunk. But the banker thought he was such a great guy that he even put money in it himself. But then he sold real estate, and one time he said he took some clients out to dinner, people he was trying to sell some property to. And the bill was so high, he only had 10 cents left in his pocket for the tip. And as he went out the door, he saw the waiter pick up the dime and throw it on the floor. And so Pop, of course, never wanted to stop even for a 10-cent good humor bar, whereas Mama, who had some money of her own, would take us the next day, would take us into Best and Company in New York and get coats with little velvet collars. Now, Meg remembers that. I wasn't tuned into any of that kind of stuff. But they were very supportive, and they made sure that we did a lot of good things. Of course, the other side of that is what we refer to as the Mead Rd syndrome. And that's, if you didn't do things quite well enough, the idea was, well, that's all right. We're sure you'll do better next time. And that worked for some of us better than for others of us. But that was definitely a factor. But one time that I remember this, they woke us up. I think Jay was about 2. It was before we went down to Chapel Hill. So I must have been about 8 or 9, something like that. They woke us up and took us outside at night. And there were northern lights all around the entire horizon, 360 degrees, all reaching up to the zenith. It was stunning, absolutely stunning. It's very rare, but it does happen, and they woke us up to see it, and I'm really glad.
I remember you once had us look at the northern lights at our on Belmont Avenue.
Yeah, it's harder to see the northern lights these days because there's so much light pollution. So, but it's a beautiful thing. Another thing I thought about was sewing. I loved to sew, and to me it was a practical thing. Yesterday we had a luncheon with the project group because one of the members who had moved to Georgia came back for a little visit. I have to say, I have had a lot of very close friends move away, and it makes me sad. And then, it's not the same. You don't talk about the little stuff. And but Mary Lyon, Marion Nelson, and Susan Andreessen, and now Ann Benson. But anyway, it was a nice luncheon we were all talking about, and somehow, maybe because we were eating a delicious lunch, but we started talking about foods that we had known. I said to them, when you were little, when you were sick, did you have milk toast? And just about everybody had. And when you were sick and you had a really bad cold or stomach upset or something, it was warm milk, and then there was white bread toasted, and then butter, and then sometimes a little sugar or nutmeg or cinnamon or something like that. And we talked about junket, which I meant to look it up. It's made from rennet, something odd like hooves of cattle or something.
Stomach.
Huh?
The stomach of baby cattle.
The stomach of baby
calf. Because they have the enzyme to deal with milk, yeah.
Okay, I thought it was, and then people didn't really want to hear that. But anyway, junket, and then we were, of course, when I when Pop had the chickens, it was my job to collect the eggs. So we had a lot of fresh eggs. And we also used to churn our own butter. We had a nice glass container about like that, and it had a wooden paddle that went around, and you sat there and you went round and round and round and round and round and round and round, and eventually you got butter and then the milk that was left over. And then we started talking about after the war, when it was called oleo, now called margarine, oleo-margarine, and it would come in a great big plastic bag, and it was dead white like Crisco, and it had a little capsule in it that was the coloring, and you pinched the capsule to let the coloring out, and then you had to knead this white stuff until it was yellow, because the dairy lobby wouldn't allow it at that time, wouldn't allow it to be sold as yellow, too much like butter. And then people would do refinishing furniture or painting or pottery, quilting, just anything that you had done. We very occasionally made things together, but usually it was just showing what we had done. And that's a wonderful group. That has been going on since 1960, and this is 2010. Now, we lost the founder of it fairly soon. One person moved away, came back, moved away, came back permanently now. Somebody else moved away, and now another person has moved away. And we actually added a person a couple of years ago, and our kids teased us because they said, "What? Nothing ever happens in Williamsport?" But they have a new member of the project group. And then another group that was really very fine. When I was very much in favor of breastfeeding, and when I was pregnant with Burr, the fourth child, the pediatrician said, "You know, there's an organization, it's La Leche League, and they encourage women to breastfeed. You ought to think about doing something like that." And I didn't do anything. And then a couple of months later, he said it again, and so I did start a group. And I called people that I knew who had breastfed, and we also met once a month, and we encouraged people. There were all kinds of reasons that people had to breastfeed. Because Williamsport is a fairly small town, we had a huge socioeconomic range of people, and it just was a very good organization. We would call new mothers when they came home from the hospital, and we'd say, you know, sometimes this is a difficult time because you've been in the hospital. Of course, in those days you stayed in 5 days, but when my mother had babies, they stayed in 2 weeks in bed. No wonder they were weak when they got up. Anyway, we'd call them when they got home, because then, you know, you had to do the housekeeping, etc., and maybe you had younger. We'd say with people who had their first child, we'll say, well, you know, you're fortunate because it's your first child and you don't have to worry about toddlers and so on. And we'd say to people who had more than one child that, well, you're fortunate because, you know, you're a little bit more used to it. The first one is always the first one. So it was very good. We never did join La Leche League. They were too hard-nosed about things. I mean, you know, if you didn't breastfeed, the only reason they allowed was if you had active tuberculosis. And there were some parts of that organization that made people feel bad. We did not want to make people feel bad if they didn't want to or couldn't or had difficulties or something. What we did try to do was to support them, to get rid of some of the old wives' tales, to tell them what if they had questions, to invite them to the meetings, bring their babies. There were always lots of babies at the meetings. And after a while, this went on for years. After a while, we decided we'd write our own book. Oh my gosh. That experience really prepared me for being on the school board. There were 5 very strong-minded women. And we wrote this booklet. Each person took a different section, like getting ready, first week's home, blah, blah, blah. So each person would then bring their section and read it, show it to the others, and read it and read. I'm telling you, we argued about things, whether you should say usually or often. And then we were going through this process, and, we did it not during the meetings, we did it separately. And then along came a very nice young woman, and she whisked in and said, "Oh, well, I can help you." But she said, "I think you ought to trim it down to about a third of what it is." She said, "I was an English major, so, I think I can help you." Well, I think 3 out of the 5 of us were English majors, and I'm telling you, we elbowed her out of there so fast she couldn't see straight.
Set.
Couple of odds and ends I thought of. One thing is we have the old family saying, and that is, keep looking. I even did it in cross stitch for somebody or other. And I have to say that color means a lot to me. I really love color. And I'm addicted to, well, chocolate, but dark chocolate. Fabrics also. And I love fabric prints, often flowered ones. This happens to be a Liberty print. But if I like a print in the fabric, I'll still like it 20 years later. And in my closet in the workroom, I have stacks of fabric, and some of them are probably 20 years old. But, maybe I'll get to them someday. In the same, and I'm also absolutely love reading. And to me, one of the biggest thrills in life is to see when your children or grandchildren learn how to read. It's just wonderful. I love reading, and sometimes I might, if there's nothing else on, I can read for 10 hours a day and absolutely love it. So, and I belong to a book group that's been meeting for 25 years. We read classics, nonfiction, fiction, all kinds of things. It's just very good. Now, Jim was very fond of his jazz music, of course, but also photography. And when we went on trips, he would take 1,000 pictures. In fact, when we were on a trip in Japan, my sister noticed that Jim, the minute Mount Fuji came into view, he immediately put the camera up. He thought seemed to think that all looking at things was through the camera lens. So, but he took wonderful pictures, and then I would, get them down to a reasonable number so that we could show them. And he had a lot of medical slides. He gave a lot of talks, and he had all those slides divided in a cabinet by subject. And after he died, I called up Lycoming College, and the biology department took those slides and used them in their work. Well, today is Easter Sunday, so I guess I will talk a little bit about religion. As I've said, my parents were both brought up Scotch Covenanters, and then passed through the Presbyterian Church briefly, and then became Episcopalians. And I go to Trinity Episcopal Church every Sunday, and I do some volunteer work for them and so on. But I consider myself kind of a floater, because I have very strong belief in God, but not such strong belief in Jesus. I'm working my way toward that, but they're just parts of the creed that I just don't say, because maybe they're true, maybe they're not, but I can't say that I believe them. So it's kind of up in the air. Okay, back to some earlier days. this two-room country school that we went to was about 1.25 miles away. And when our brothers went there, our younger brothers went there, they had a bus, but we walked. And because my mother's mother, we called her Grammy. It was spelled Grammy, but we called her Grammy. She lived up the hill from us, and we were supposed to stop in and say hello to her every day on our way home from school. I'm ashamed to say that sometimes what we did mostly was rush to snap up the Saturday Evening Post, that tells you how old we are, and look at the cartoons and so on. But she had some special toys there, too. She had a puppet of the Dumbo from the Seven Dwarfs, and she had a...
Wait, Dumbo, the Seven Dwarfs?
Yeah.
Dumbo was a elephant? No?
Well,
Different.
but it was also the Seven Dwarfs.
Okay. I thought it was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
It is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. One of the Seven Dwarfs was Dumbo.
So not the elephant.
Not the elephant.
Okay, got it.
Okay,
Got
Dumbo,
it. Okay,
Dumbo
got it.
from
Got it,
the
okay.
Snow White
All right.
and the Seven Dwarfs.
Got it,
She had
got it.
puppet. And she had a map of the world, a jigsaw puzzle, which I liked. She also had a lamp, which I thought that I had gotten, and I don't know where it is. It was a porcelain figure, a very elegant lady in a pink satin dress with trim, and then the skirt ballooned out, and it was kept out with an iron, metal cage, and then the light bulb was underneath, so when you lit it, the skirt all lit up. It was very beautiful, and I thought I had it, but, lots of things, I don't know where they are. And she also had, her whole hall and living room were lined with wonderful bookcases, many of which I have in my house now. And they were the kind where you could stack them, and they were about 3 feet wide, and then they had glass doors that you could pull out and let down. And those, I must say, have served me very, very well. She died when I was a freshman in college, so that was early 1950. Early 1950.
She was Mama's mother?
Yeah. Actually, after this operation, I don't know how well I'm going to be able to talk for a while. The first week, certainly not very well. They put a plate in, and my voice will be very nasal through the nose, and if I'm very clever, I can spew food out of my right nostril.
Thank you for sharing.
But on a serious note, though, the lesson of this is, if somebody sees something unusual and says, you need to check this out, this needs to be checked, then do it. Check it out. Yeah. So then we went on, hi-fi, and then stereo, and and color TV. My gosh, color TV. And then going on, of course, then got into computers, and all my family, of course, had computers. And one time before Christmas, Slater called and he said, just hypothetically, what would you think if the 4 of us got together and got you a computer? I said, absolutely not. I don't need it. I don't want it. No, thank you. And he said, well, Mom, we already bought it. So now, of course, it's wonderful because I do email, especially with 4 families out of town. I am extremely fortunate to have 1 family in town. But I look some things up. I do emails. I don't spend hours and hours. I'm not the kind of person who looks up at the clock and says, oh my gosh, I've been here for 3 hours. But the things I do, I really do like. Now, because my Honda Odyssey car, is 12 and a half years old, and it only plays audio tapes, there is a little gadget, though. You can play MP3 players and CD players through the audio tape thing. Okay, but the library did away with all its nonfiction audio tapes, and so now I have an MP3 player with which I have which I'm struggling with. And then just recently, because I'm going in the hospital with this mouth cancer, I bought a cell phone and I can't even get it registered. So I'm going to have to call the guy tomorrow and see if I can hand register it. I really sort of didn't want the cell phone, but I understand it will be convenient for people for a while. And I think I may use it intensively. I do not plan to hand the number out except to very close friends and my sisters and my family, my kids and their spouses. I'm considering it the cancer phone and the emergency phone. And in 2 days, I will be going to New York and stay with Meg. And then on Wednesday, it will be the 21st of April, 2010. I'm going to have an operation taking part of my jaw and about 3 or 4 teeth out. And it's because I did not pay attention to my dentist when he said, you have a little bump there, a little spot, looks like a little burn or something. I don't know what it is. You ought to have it checked out. And he said it to me several months in a row, and I didn't do anything about it. And so now I'm into extensive surgery and adjustments of the prosthesis called the obturator. So, once again, I'm being dragged into the 21st century, and I'm considering a cell phone. Of course, because I'm sort of hard of hearing, that's one of the things I'm looking for. And I'm also looking for something that really is a cell phone and nothing else. I don't really feel a need to text or anything else. In fact, really the only reason I'm thinking of a cell phone is because of being in the hospital and being in touch with people who are doing things. Our mother was very hard of hearing. In fact, when she was 44, she was taking lip reading lessons down in Chapel Hill. So that was not just old age. Of course, with old age, she got much harder of hearing and finally could hardly hear anything at all. She had the kind of loss that they said that hearing aids didn't help, but I don't know, it seemed to us that they helped her. But she was still so alert and interested in things. She would go to concerts and talks, and my father would scribble notes to her in his truly illegible handwriting. And she would kind of nod, and then, he'd go on and write some more. So they had a very good marriage and a very nice old age together. They were lucky to be together for so many years. They were married in 1927. Okay. Well, technology is a wonderful thing. I would say offhand that I am technology challenged, but when you think, for instance, my parents were born in 1900. There weren't any cars. By the time they died, men had walked on the moon, and all kinds of technology and television and so on. We listened to radio when I was growing up. We listened to the Lone Ranger and something green.
Green Hornet.
Anyway, the Green Hornet, that's it. The Green Hornet and the Shadow. One night I was listening to the Shadow. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows. Well, I was supposed to be sleeping. It was late at night. I heard my father coming down the hall, so I switched it off. He poked his head in the door and he said, "Is your radio on?" I said, "No." And he went away and I switched it back on. Oh, what innocent crimes. But anyway, we listened to the radio. And then when my younger brothers were in high school, the neighbors, the Benzs, got a television, and my brothers would go over all the time because my parents didn't have it. And finally, Margaret Benz said, it's really a little inconvenient for them to be here quite so much. So my parents got television. Jim and I, when we were married, didn't have a television set until his wealthy aunt, who was a Christian Science, came. She wanted to come and visit the Mother Church, the Christian Science Church in Boston. So she came and she wanted to watch the $64,000 question, and we didn't have a TV set, so she told us to go out and buy one. We bought one that was such high quality it went out of business because nobody ever had to buy a second one. But we did have hi-fi, and boy, it used to blast. We put together parts of it ourselves. My welding held up, not welding, soldering. My soldering held up very nicely, and we did have that. And then we used some of the wedding money for that, and with some of the rest of the money, I bought a Singer sewing machine. It's a portable, if you have the strength. But it didn't ever sit in a cabinet. And that was in 1953. I still use that machine. It doesn't do zigzags or anything else fancy like that, but it's a good, steady machine. And it can sew over pins, which is a great advantage because you can pin the material, and then if you're at right angles, you can sew right over without taking them out as you go along. Higher speed. An extremely trustworthy Singer sewing machine, and that was a great investment. I want to tell a couple of stories about Jim, my husband, who was just a really fine doctor, thoracic surgeon, excellent doctor. One was when the old jail was going to be closed down. You could go to the new jail and take a tour and see what it was like. And then after they moved the prisoners over, we toured the old jail, and we were in back of some people who kept, oh, that's where Uncle Paul was, and I remember this part, and so on. But at the new jail, a woman came up to me, and she said, is that Dr. Harrison? And I said, yes. And she went up to him, and she said, Dr. Harrison, you may not remember me. My name is so-and-so, and I had such and such a condition, and I was pregnant. And all the other doctors said, you really should terminate this pregnancy. It's not going to work well for your own health. But you said that you thought you could work around it. And here's the boy, here's the result of that decision, and here was her 8-year-old son standing next to her. Now that was really wonderful. And there was something else that happened. The father of a family worked at what was then known as Avco, known as the Motors. It was a huge industry in town, even when we came to town in 1960. A lot of other things had gone, like the tanning and the rubber factory and stuff. But anyway, the shop, Avco, the Motors, was still going. The father worked there, but he lived way up the creek. His wife was a nurse, and she had to go on duty for her shift, and he was late because he had to attend a meeting, and they left their 2 little boys home alone very briefly, and the father got there as soon as he could, and he walked in the door, and there was the younger boy lying on the floor bleeding, and the older boy had climbed up on to a closet, to a shelf. They didn't even know he knew where the gun was, but the gun was up there, the gun was loaded, and he accidentally shot his brother. I was kind of worried about his mental health after that. That's a lot to carry around. Anyway, they called Jim. Jim told them to put a tube down the throat. They sent him down, and Jim operated. And
You mean the ambulance put a tube down
in
his
an
throat?
ambulance.
Yeah.
In an ambulance. And Jim operated on him, and he did very well. He did very well. Years later, Slater was teaching at Jersey Shore.
No, this was up at Sullivan
County. Okay. Of course. Well, that makes more sense. Okay. Slater was teaching up at Sullivan County after he'd had the Guillain-Barré, and a young senior said to him, was your dad a doctor? Is your dad a doctor? And Slater said, yeah, you never know what's coming when somebody says that. Yeah, he said, yeah. And he said, he saved my life. My brother accidentally shot me, and your dad saved my life. And Slater always said he was one of the nicest kids, just a super kid. And that was just a wonderful story to hear. I just remembered another medical thing. This is really weird. I had something called Transient Global Amnesia. I went to the grocery store. I went to the recycling. I came back, and there was some work being done in the basement.
Wait, you don't remember any of this, right? The recycling place and the...
Well, I remember recycling, and I vaguely remember the grocery store. But I came back, and there was a mason who was doing some work, and I complimented him on the walls. He did a beautiful job on the walls. And then a minute later, I looked at him, and I said, "Who are you? Why are you here?" And he tried to explain and everything. And then I think I called Slater, or Slater called something. Anyway, I was complaining about how things were all over the basement out of place. And at first he thought it was just a disagreement between the mason and me. And then something made him call back. And I said, "Slater, why aren't you in school?" And he said, "Mom, remember, I'm on leave this year. I'm putting things on the computer." And I said, "Oh, you better come over." And just then, Abby happened to call. And I said to her, "Something's wrong." So she talked to the mason and she said, "Please take her down to the hospital, because if she's having a stroke, the sooner she gets there, the better." So he did, bless his heart. And then Slater came along, and Slater stayed with me for hours. Naomi came to give him a break, but he stayed me hours and hours. The first doctor in the ER recognized what it was, but because it's so different from people who come in with a stroke or a heart attack, he called in all the other ER doctors and said, "Look at this." The thing was, I'd be perfectly rational and capable, and I'd smile. Slater said I kept my sense of humor. I was polite. I gave them the information about the insurance and everything. That was all fine. But then every other minute or so, I'd say, "But where am I? Why am I here? Who brought me here? What's happening? What's happening?" I have no memory of this at all, mind you. No memory at all. So they did a CAT scan that said I had not had a major stroke. As it turns out, I did have a mini stroke that was so small it didn't show up on the CAT scan, and I'm perfectly recovered. So anyway, they put me in the hospital, and I was there that night and the next day. And sometime during the next day, Slater, I said to him, "What am I doing here?" He handed me a paper, and it said, "Mom, I've answered this question 60 times in the last 10 minutes, and my mouth is getting tired. So here's what you had." And he explained what he had. He said that he had called the other kids and so on. And apparently I read it, and I said exactly the same thing that I had said many, many, many other times. I said same voice, same intonation, same words, everything exactly the same.
Yeah, it was about every minute and a half.
About every minute and a half.
Yeah.
And among other things that mounted in about 300 times, I said, "But listen, if I'm a vegetable, just pull the plug. Pull the plug." And then I gradually regained it. But it's so weird. I will never get that memory back. That is just a part of a day in my life that's completely gone, which is kind of interesting. And then I'd talk to people later, and they'd tell me little things that I had done. Like when I was in the grocery store, I complained to somebody I knew that people were taking things out or putting things into my cart. As it turned out, two of the things I had put in, 2 giant bags of Frito-Lay corn chips, which I never should have eaten, but man, they were good. Well,
I hope you didn't take somebody's cart.
Now, you can laugh about things. I hope I keep my sense of humor. One of the things that that I feel I do. I really like to laugh with people about the funny things that happen with kids in everyday life, the ironic things. Just, there is always something to look. And I've always said that a sense of humor implies a sense of perspective. So I hope I keep my sense of humor. We took a lot of wonderful trips. In the United States, we did some, when the kids were quite young, we all went out to Los Angeles to see Jim's brother Lee, who was working with the Walt Disney Company. He invented a method of computer animation before many other people did it. Of course, it was analog. And he never had a good business manager, so we all invested big bucks and lost them. But it was a wonderful invention. And actually, he was married to Marilou, who grew up in the house next door to the one I grew up in. So two brothers married two neighbors.
Didn't you introduce them too?
Yes, we introduced them. Anyway, we were on the way back. I wanted the kids to have the experience of sleeping in a Pullman train. So when we went to this street, like a open street market, Mexican in Los Angeles on the way to the train, and there was all kinds of, nice souvenirs, and I think we probably all brought sombreros, and Rebecca bought a pair of castanets. And when we got to the train station, there was Burl Ives. And so, of course, we rushed up and told him how much we liked his songs and so on. That was very nice. I hope he had a bigger room than we did. We had a fairly small room. It had a fold-down sink. And Rebecca was practicing her castanets. It drove us crazy. We made her go into the bathroom, but the problem was there was an open ceiling, so we didn't really escape from the noise. But the little kids Rebecca and Burr went to sleep in the upper bunks because that was fun. And then Abby and Slater stayed up a little longer, and then they moved up to the upper bunks, and we brought Rebecca and Burr down into our lower bunks. So that was a great experience, and we were going from Los Angeles to Flagstaff, and then we took a bus to the Grand Canyon. That was a really great experience. We had a lot of good traveling, lots of visits with families, which is really wonderful. Then in addition, I used to say to Jim, we have relatives in Uganda and in Japan. We really ought to go see those places when they're there. And it was very difficult for him because he was in private practice. It meant that he had to close down completely, not do any surgery. He didn't have the best aftercare from any other person. It meant it was a real difficult thing for him to get away. Anyway, he finally said, I think so. We can do it. He never told me what changed his mind. But I happened to overhear him. And he was talking on the phone, and he said, yeah, my good friend Howie Gadboys, we were in residency in Boston, we were in residency in Philadelphia, and we were great jazz buddies. We worked every day together, and we alternated nights and weekends. And one morning, he woke up, and he said, oh my God, I got the worst headache. And he died of a cerebral hemorrhage. And that's what made Jim change his mind. And it was wonderful, because we went on this trip. My brother Jay was in Uganda, and he set up a tour of a lot of the game parks. It happened that he had to come back, leave Uganda, before we got there. But he had it all set up, and we had a marvelous time. We saw all kinds of animals. And then we had a one-day stopover in Kenya, where there's a game park right near the airport. And we saw lions and giraffes, which we had not seen in Uganda. And some people we had met took us to a snake farm and a fabric store. The men and boys went to the snake farm, and of course the girls and I went to the fabric store. And we had such a good time that the next year we went to Japan, where my sister and her husband were. And they were living in Tokyo, and they had set up a tour for us to Kyoto and some other places, and that was wonderful. And you know, you go to Japan, and the things are so beautiful and so spare, and you come back and you think, why do I have all this junk? And about 3 days later, of course, I reverted to my usual hoarding of junk and too much stuff. But that was a wonderful trip. And those trips were in 68 and 69. And then in 74, we went to Korea because Don was stationed in Korea then. And that was interesting. We went to the demilitarized zone. And you could make all the jokes you want about commies under the bed and so on. But I'm telling you, we went there, and you could look through binoculars, and you could see the North Koreans staring back at you with binoculars. And you went into the house where the building where they were supposed to be meeting. There's no peace treaty yet. There's just an armistice. And you'd see this line running across the floor and up and across the table and so on. And there was a little bit of upmanship there because the flagpoles of North Korea and America on the tables had to be the same height. But then they'd start building up the bases to sort of one-up the other country. But it was spooky. And also, just a couple of weeks before that, the North Koreans had stormed into one of the sentry posts and killed a couple of the American soldiers. So it really was scary. I went back to Korea in 1990 when my sister Meg and her friend Lucy were turning 60, and I went to Korea and stayed with them for a while, and then the three of us went to China, and we had a wonderful tour of China. It was the year after Tiananmen Square, and so, you know, there were practically no Western tourists at all. But we saw some, and people were a little hesitant to come up and talk with us, although some did. But it was all arranged, and we had we were on the plane. Meg said, well, I have a sign that has our name on it. I said, Meg, look around the plane. We're the only white people, the only Caucasians on this plane. I think we'll stand out enough. And it was great. Oh, there was a story. Each city we went to, we had a tour guide and a van that took us around. We wanted to look at different things. What I really, really wanted to see were the terracotta warriors in Xi'an. And as we got closer, I got more and more afraid that it would be an anticlimax. And then we got there, and it was just wonderful to see this huge expanse with all these warriors. Many of all the bodies were modeled, in many different positions, but they were, each one might be like 500 others. But the faces apparently were all different, and they were possibly modeled after real soldiers of the emperor who first brought a lot of China together as a country. That was really thrilling. And we saw those rounded mountains that they often have by the Li River. They often have them in painted Chinese paintings. And then we went, the only really kind of unpleasant place we were was a place called Da Nang, which was a coal mining region. The air just seemed full of coal. And there were always people walking along the sides of the roads to pick up the chunks of coal that had been dropped from the trucks. Well, we went, there were some huge Buddhas, and we went to see them. And then the next day, Lucy wanted to go see the Buddhas again, so she did. And Meg and I were supposed to go to a factory that built steam engines, but it had closed, so we didn't do that. But when we were there, we had a very tall woman guide, young girl guide. And she was so tall, in fact, that a lot of the traveling Chinese tourists would look up at her and then look down at her. And then, my sister's even taller than I am, but she really was tall. Anyway, I had a pair of sandals, and one of the straps broke. And so I said to her, do you think we could have this fixed? And she said, oh yes, there'll be a street cobbler someplace. So she saw a cobbler, and we stopped, and she gave him the sandals and explained about it. And I asked her, can I take a picture? And she said yes. I should have asked the man. And I didn't ask him. And I took 2 pictures, and he was not happy. And pretty soon, there were 10 people surrounding us. It was a little scary. She said, get in the car. It was a little scary. And so we got in the car. And when she got in after us, she said, we said, why was he upset? He said something about, he felt it was demeaning that here he was, a street cobbler, working on the street and so on. And I said, gosh, Slater has these wonderful pictures of people in Bangladesh, and it's so, they're making something out of nothing. And it's so innovative and so enterprising. Well, anyway, then we went to the next place, and there were all kinds of government cars and police cars, and we thought, uh-oh. But actually, it was just some people from the Central Council. Then, the next day, she said, my boss needs to speak to you. So he came to lunch, and he spoke to me, and he said, the cobbler is upset, and he wants you to give him the film back. And I said, oh, I don't want to do that. I'll miss all my pictures. And he said, well, then if you don't give the film back, he won't give you your sandals back. I thought, fine. They were just an old beat-up pair of sandals, and I not only have a good bunch of pictures, I have a great story to tell. And later, my sister said, maybe it wasn't that it was demeaning and all. Maybe he was out there doing something without a license that he should have had. But anyway, that was really a great trip. Then we went to Shanghai. And we went to the opera, and we went to the Shanghai circus. They had domestic cats, ordinary cats, trained to walk across a tightrope. I've never been able to train cats to do anything but answer to the can opener opening their cat food. But they also, they had a panda, and the panda was all dressed up in a little outfit, and they had him sit down, and he had a fork and a knife, a fork and a spoon in his hands, and he was supposed to, be eating. It was interesting because the applause was minimal, and I think people just didn't like to see the panda dressed up like that. That was demeaning. That really was. Then they had about 8 absolutely beautiful, gorgeous Bengal tigers. Not Bengal, tigers. Whatever. They were just incredibly lovely. And the man brought them out, and he had them all lie down in a row. And they just, majestic. So then he was going to have them go through certain acts. And he signaled them to get up on little pedestals. And one tiger was up on its pedestal, and another tiger came too close. So the first tiger on the pedestal leaned down and kind of swiped his paw at the one that was walking by. And the trainer snapped his whip at the tiger who had swiped the other. And the tiger exhibited the independence that felines do. He lifted up his tail and let out a great big squirt. And we heard a kind of a muffled cry from the audience, but no trampling of lawyers as it would have been in America. About 2005, Meg and Don were going to go with a group of William's friends and some other people they knew on a trip to Egypt, sponsored by Williams College. And Meg was telling me about it. And then she said, Jan, why don't you come? 2 hours later, I called her, and I said, why not? I'm all signed up. And it was great. We were there for about 13 days. We saw the pyramids, the Sphinx, and so on. We saw a lot of things. We saw the tombs, and we had a trip up the Nile. It's very hard to remember that the Nile runs north. Trip up the Nile on a ship, and it was wonderful. I was a little afraid because there had been some unrest, but we really traveled in a tourist bubble, so we were not, the only time we really were very much among ordinary people was when we went to a couple of markets, but it was really amazing to see things that were that old and still around and still full of presence. Then in 2008, I went to Peru. I went with a travel company a friend of mine had told me about. I thought, if I'm going to go all that way to Peru, I want to see not only Machu Picchu, I want to see the Nazca lines. Those are the lines that are etched into the soil of a flat plain which doesn't get much rain. And they're all kinds of geometric trapezoids, and then they're huge figures etched in. Birds and snakes, monkeys, and a person, just all kinds of things. And you have to be flying over. We were flying over in a little 12-passenger plane, which would swoop down on one, tilt on one side so those people could see, and then make a fast turn and swoop down, tilting the other way so people could see. No, there are all kinds of mysteries about why and how those were done. They think the trapezoids point to some water sources that were underneath. The Peruvians really had a lot of advanced ideas. They have all these wonderful terraces. Their mountains are very steep and very close together, not like the Colorado mountains that some of the people on the tour were used to. Very steep. And they had a lot of them arranged so that as the snow melted on the top, it would run down and irrigate all the different terraces, and some of them are still being used today. And anyway, nobody knows quite how these things were done, but I think that they had their reasons, and they thought that the trapezoids might have pointed to some underwater sources also. And then Machu Picchu was lovely. And there again, something so old and mysterious, nobody knows why it was abandoned so quickly. And I was very proud of myself because I huffed and puffed my way up to the point of the Sun Temple. Of course, I was panting like crazy as I went and had to rest every time. But then you could look down on it.
Do you know how high it was?
No, I think where we were before in Cusco, I think was about 12,000 feet. And we went down to the valley. Some people were badly affected. When you got off the bus, there were all these nice Peruvian old ladies with plastic bags full of coca leaves. But I didn't, you're supposed to roll them up and put them in your mouth and kind of suck on them, and then it would keep you from getting altitude sickness. But they said anybody who had any heart difficulty should not do it. And I have irregular heartbeats. So I didn't do it. But there was a magic cream that I would put on my forehead and whatever, And the other thing was, every time you travel, you've got to have lots of water with you, safe water with you. But anyway, we went up there and looked down, and our guide told us that he thought that it wouldn't be too long until they began restricting the number of people allowed at any one time, because there's a certain amount of wear and tear with people trampling around, even though you walk on a lot of grass and stones. When we were going up to this Sun Temple, it was called the Inca Trail. This was not hard-packed dirt. This was very rough stones, and the steps sometimes. When we had another place where we had stopped and we climbed up some big hill and the steps were extremely high. And again, you're walking on stone. Really good idea to have a walking stick and good sneakers and so on, which I did. But that was another lovely trip. You know, it's nice. I've been to Chautauqua twice to spend a week. The first time the theme was on film and media. The second time, Roger Rosenblatt had 5 people speaking. Authors that I was not all that familiar with or crazy about, but I read some things by them before I went, and it just was interesting to hear them talk. I was hoping to go again this year. I don't know whether that's going to work out with this mouth cancer, so I don't know. But there's something going on from 7 in the morning to 11 at night. There's a main lecture every single morning, and then every afternoon there's something that may be a little more religious, but not necessarily. And they have all kinds of extra speakers, like Jeffrey Toobin on the Supreme Court and so on. So that's really interesting, and it's a nice drive over along southern New York. Well, I hope I get there again this year. Okay. One time, my sister, who went to Middlebury College and majored in Russian, was staying at Middlebury for the summer program, and they were immersed in Russian, supposed to speak nothing else. And all the rest of us were packed up into a car at the end of the summer, and we were going to pick her up and then go up and see the St. Lawrence Seaway and all that. So my brothers and I this is very politically incorrect. My brothers and I thought we were hysterically funny because we started to talk like this, and we thought we were just the cat's meow. And we talked like this, and we made a lot of fun of each other, and we talked like this. And then we picked up Meg. Meg, of course, was embarrassed to tears, and she really didn't want us to do that. So, well, then when we went into a hamburger joint, my brothers and I were still talking like this, and we still thought we were pretty funny. And my sister said, "Dad, make them stop." And my father said, "Woof, woof, 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 woof." Senior moment. David McCullough. I think it was about the Great Bridge, which I reread recently and just loved all over again. And I just wrote to him. He lived in Truro, Mass, where, it was a small town in those days. And he wrote back and said that it was, you hardly ever saw somebody carrying your book, let alone reading it, so it was nice to hear from somebody who had enjoyed it. And I wrote to Scott Turow when he wrote 1L, which was about the first year of law school at Harvard. And I encouraged him to keep on writing, which he certainly did. And I've written to, probably about 20 authors. I only write to authors when I've really, really liked their books. So of course they're happy to hear from me. And almost everyone writes back a very nice note. In fact, one wife wrote back and said her husband would be pleased to read the letter, but he was in Italy doing research for his next book. And so, he couldn't write at this time. That was nice of her. And it's part of reading. In fact, one time I gave a talk to the Friends of the Library about books I've liked so much that I wrote the authors and they wrote back.